Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to the SAN podcast. And I'm delighted today to have with me two very close friends of mine to discuss Shi'ism in the academic world. Father Christopher Clohessy, Sayyid Sajjad Rizvi, I bid you what I'm sure you know how to reply to now, the Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
Even I'm a bit formal, I'm very formal at the moment, but I'm sure it'll all change.
Sure.
And we're going to have a lovely discussion. As many of you know, and some of you may not know, but Sayyid Sajjad Rizvi over here was my PhD supervisor. And I'm sure he'll agree that my PhD was the best one that he supervised.
Well, it finished.
Always ever so polite, said Sajjad, that you could never put past him. But Father Clohessy, just take it that it was a really good PhD.
I believe you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we know very well that a lot of the times when you hear about Shi'ism, you would imagine that most of the knowledge in relation to Shīʿī sciences of theology and law and philosophy are mainly in the traditional centers of learning, the seminaries, the houses. But we also know that the academic world has also produced some unbelievable literature by both members of the Shia school as well as those from outside of the Shia school. So what I wanted to do in this episode is for us to have an outline in terms of the history of Shia studies within the academic world, and look at some of the pertinent topics that emerge. Sajjad, I'd like to begin by asking you, when we're talking, of course, Shia studies, we may normally talk about 12 Shi'ism, but would you agree with me that the Fatimid period meant that possibly the earliest discussions, at least from non-Muslims and the way that they viewed Shi'ism, may have been much more related to Ismaili Shi'ism more than 12 Shi'ism?
To a certain extent, that's true. With early Orientalism, they were really interested in texts that they found. So if you look at the early German or the German-trained Orientalists in particular, they were interested in Zaydis when they came across Zaydi texts. Some of the early Italian Orientalists were as well because of the repositories of Zaydi manuscripts in places like the Ambrosiana. And also because of the Ismaili text, which had survived in a number of places, the Fatimid period in particular, linked with North Africa, the texts which were extant in places like Egypt. So certainly, I think with early Orientalists who were interested in Shi'ism, they were interested in all sorts of Shi'ism, and I think one of the reasons for that also is that the way some of the Germans and others approached the study of Islam was actually broader than it later became, and certainly broader than some of the non-German scholarship, especially the Anglophone scholarship, which was far more focused on Sunnis. So, one very good example, if you look at Goldziher's very famous early work on Quranic exegesis, he includes everyone. He doesn't exclude anyone. So, that still remains a wonderful introduction to exegesis among Sunnis, amongst 12 Shia, amongst Ismailis, Zaydis, everyone. And so that shows that there was that kind of broad approach, which, was certainly there in the late 19th, early 20th century.
So which texts would you say that they had access to pretty early? Which type of scholars would they have access to?
They definitely had scholars. In terms of the Ismaili tradition, they were familiar with the works of Qadi Nu'man, of course. They were familiar with Kirmani. Some of the Fatimid texts, as they had survived in the Tayyibi tradition in Yemen, was quite important. So on the Ismaili side, it was that. On the Ithnashari side, in many ways, some of the earliest work was on a few of the really famous figures from Baghdad, such as Sheikh Mufid and Sayyid Sharif Murtada from the 11th century. But I would say on the whole, it was very much the Safavid thinkers. So much later, 16th, 17th, 18th century scholarship. And that's because it was those texts which were widespread. So, nowadays when we think about what the classical Shīʿī tradition is, we tend to go back to the 10th, 11th century. But in early Orientalism, that was not the case. And in many ways, I think that reflected the situation in the seminary. Because in the seminary, people tended to study texts which were much later as well, because they felt either the early texts had been superseded, or people just weren't circulating those texts or even studying them in the same way. So in many ways, you've got this kind of co-creation of a tradition which is going on in the 19th, 20th century, coming together to a certain extent of the seminary with some of the early aspects, some of the early major figures of Orientalism. And that's precisely why nowadays you're getting, in some quarters, a kind of rehabilitation of classical Orientalism as a very serious academic inquiry, which took the scholarship of the seminary very seriously as well.
Why would there be an interest by these German figures or these Italian scholars, even certain Jesuit priests? When I'm looking at the likes, I open up on, Henri Lamon, and you open up others such as Wellhausen and others. They're going deep into the study of Shi'ism. What was interesting the church in that period?
Well, actually, Henri Lamon, I think he was a Belgian Jesuit, he was scathing of Shia Islam and scathing of the whole concept of the Ahl Bayt and of the family of the Prophet. In fact, he was one of the kind of catalysts that caused me to move a little more deeply into that, because he had little time for Ali, little time for Fâṭima, the rest of the family members. It is of interest that when I first began to study, it was the Francophone scholars, most of all, with whom we dealt, and almost all of them concentrated on Francophone North African Sunni law. That was the thing that drove them. There was, when I began studying, almost no emphasis on Shia Islam at all. It was regarded as a minor sect, and which could be easily ignored because Sunni law, especially North African Sunni law, was far more important and far better sourced. So that when I began to study Shia Islam, I was one of the first in my kind of milieu to begin such studies. Goldsai is an interesting character because he's an obscure character who never renounced his Judaism, but thought of himself as a Muslim and was keen to go to Salah. And finally, I think through the efforts of a friend, did get there. But there were others like Lamans, like Wellhausen, who were less favorable towards the Shia context. And then later on, you get, in the French tradition, you get Massignon. And Massignon, too, was something of a syncretist. He saw relationships between Christianity and Shia personalities that he thought quite important, and which he may well have pushed the borders a little of those relationships. And after him, there are certainly later scholars in the French tradition who are more open. Henri Corbin, of course, is the great kind of proponent of Shia mysticism. But I've always understood that in Western Orientalism, Shia Islam was either ignored or it was treated quite badly, certainly by some of the French scholars.
It's interesting that, see someone like Dante taking us on a journey in hell, and lo and behold, who does he see?
Of course.
Of all the names in the Islamic tradition, the Prophet, peace be upon him, and Imam Ali, alayhi salam, are both, in the bottom of hell. Does that have an effect, do you think, on some of these scholars and the way they look at Shi'ism?
Look, I think the truth is that the church, particularly the Catholic Church, took a great interest in Islamic studies generally, but it was not primarily an academic pursuit. It was in order to understand the religion and, of course, for proselytism. The Catholic Church was moving. I mean, we know that in Iran, for example, there were Catholic missionaries quite early who presented the ruling Shah at that time with a copy of the scriptures, the Christian scriptures in Farsi, and another one in Arabic. But they were really studying Islam not to inculturate or to accommodate, but for the purpose of proselytism. It was only after the 1960s that the church changed direction and said, actually, the academic study of Islam, both Shia and Sunni, is is worth doing for itself without any other motives. And now that's the way the church is going.
What led you to study Shia Islam? Because I think a lot of viewers, those of you who've come across Father Clohessy's works, I've got to say that your work on Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam is an outstanding work.
Thank you.
It really is. And then your next book is on Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas alayhi salam, which I think me and Sayyid Sajjad are going to be looking forward to how many sources you could even extract in writing a...
It's a slow work because the sources are a real problem.
Yeah, what led you? Tell us a bit of that.
I trained primarily as an historian and as a theologian, Christian theologian, Catholic theologian. And I studied Islam because it was interesting, not for any passionate reason, but because I thought it was a good idea to working as a Christian clergyman in a country where there were certainly substantial numbers of Muslims to have a good grasp. South Africa.
South Africa, okay.
And so I did a general master's degree in Islamic studies. But of course, then I met Karbalāঃ. And there are two possible reactions to Karbalāঃ. You can walk on by, as countless people do, or it just kind of stops you forever. And I knew immediately that the historical factors concerning the battle itself, but more especially the personalities who inhabit that particular period of Shia Islam, very, very early, you could hardly even call it Shia, that particular tendency and the walaya of Ali, that would be my focus and my source of interests. And it has been ever since. But it's primarily as an historian, even less so as a theologian, because I'm not convinced that theological issues are the most important, the most pressing issues at the moment. The most pressing issues now in the world are not theological, they're in terms of human dignity, human rights, issues of justice
which can find themselves within a new theology, for example.
They can, but they are the issues that need working on most, especially in terms of this confrontation, confrontation or encounter between the religions. So it was really that. It was my...
I was always intrigued when we were at Exeter, and I was intrigued by Professor Robert Cleave, who's, one of the most important names in Shīʿī Studies and the academy. Rob's knowledge of that period, I think there are certain scholars who may have even graduated from, the seminaries who may not have gone into that period of, Shīʿī scholarship on law and some of the texts that Rob has decided to look into. And then, if you remember, my other supervisor was, of course, C.E. Bosworth.
Yeah.
The late C.E. Bosworth, who I couldn't believe when I'd sit with him. There was an encyclopedic knowledge there that was unbelievable. We built such a close relationship. Said Sajjad, would you say that Rob's passion for studying Shi'ism and C.E. Bosworth is completely different angles from which they come in, or similar?
Very different, because Bosworth was quite hostile to Shi'ism.
Yeah.
That was... whereas I think Rob, with his work, having spent a lot of time in Iran, he got interested in this because of Iran. He was, in terms of background, he'd worked on politics and history.
He was under Norman Calder, correct?
Yeah, then he went and did his dissertation with Norman Calder.
Yeah.
And then, of course, after that, he spent some time in Iran, even after that. So I think for him, it was kind of more natural to work on Shia stuff, just because that was where his interests were going. And also, I think partly one of the issues also was that it was an area which was completely devoid of any real serious academic work. So Shia law was just barren. There was nothing out there. There was, the odd article here and there. There was this kind of bibliography by Hussein Mudarrisi, but really there was nothing published in Shia law, Shia legal theory. And so he really made it he made it his field. And, sometimes when you're thinking about what to do for a PhD, you want to, in a sense, find an area that you can spend a career in, right?
Yeah.
And that you can really make it your own. You can really develop it. And the easiest way to do that, in many ways, is to find something which is just completely untouched. And it's so much so that I think now his work has had a broader impact on how people study Islamic law, not just Shia law. And also, it's having a broad impact on Shia studies. So the books which have come out, these collections that that he's edited, especially out of his legal theory project, I think will have a major impact in the field, both in terms of the study of Islamic studies as such, but also Shia studies. Of course, interestingly, Rob is very much a believer. He's a Methodist.
Yeah.
But he keeps that very separate.
Sure. How do they keep it so? Father, this is something that I get asked the most whenever me and you have done events together. And people always ask me, so he knows that much about Karbala, and he knows that much about Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, and the trials and tribulations of the Ahl al-Bayt, and Fâṭima al-Zahra alayhi salam, which was your first work, really. And why has he not become Shia? And of course, when I ask you why he's not become Shia, with maybe a small W rather than a... Really, I'm just asking on behalf of the viewers, those who've always sent in, that how could someone who sees everything that's taken place there not become Shia? And if not become Shia, how does he view these figures? Because sometimes people have this idea that you could study Shi'ism as a science and remain very aloof and cold from having any leaning towards these personalities. Like how some may have studied, for example, Nazi Germany, 1939 till 1945, a world war that takes place. We have to write essays about it. We're really intrigued by the mindset of that group and that group. How do you view Shi'ism, honestly, as a believer?
Well, I have to say, firstly, that I'm not a pluralist.
Yes.
I used to be in my young days. Now, as I grow older, pluralism worries me because it seems to have become a borderless, boundaryless, amorphous mass with no objective truth, that any path is as good as the next path. I don't believe that, because otherwise revelation begins to lose its impact, and in fact, we diminish the importance of revelation. So as a non-pluralist, as somebody who as a convinced Christian believes that Christianity is indeed the way that God has invited us to journey to him through revelation, I also refuse to close myself off from the possibility that the faith and the spiritual experience of others could be empowering and enriching for me. And not just Shia, but I have a particular affinity with Shia for a whole lot of reasons, because in fact, Shia Islam and Catholicism or Catholic Christianity, they have a whole lot of meeting points, some of them quite subtle, others quite glaringly obvious. But it's not just Shia Islam, it's Judaism, other forms of Christianity, anything which enriches me as a person or expands my horizons or even challenges the way I'm living. I mean, there's no Christian who could possibly claim that the fast of Ramadan is not challenging compared to the way we fast as Christians. So anyone who is close to that has already lost the spark of life for me. So I've been able to embrace personalities in Shia Islam. I mean, I have great love for Lady Fâṭima, for Lady Zainab. I'm a growing love for Abbas, who is an extraordinary personality, and again, sadly, kind of neglected, I think, in the academic world for obvious reasons. These people inspire me and challenge me, and I'm quite happy to ask them to pray for me without in any way compromising my Christian faith. Now, I don't know if it's because I'm stupid and I just haven't seen the obvious pitfalls, or if I've just been able to move beyond, as millions of others have. I mean, if you read someone like, people like Madlung, for example, I'm not sure what the state of Madlung is today. I think that perhaps some of his scholarship has gone a little off. But when you read Madlung writing about the successor to the Prophet, he quite clearly recognizes the claims of Ali, and he is quite clearly in favor of those claims. And you think, well, it's possible to take a side. It's possible to read history and to agree with a particular point of view. It's possible to be enriched and enhanced by another faith without necessarily embracing that faith. And I like to keep the boundaries there, because you don't want no boundaries, but a little fluid at times. Otherwise, life would be very isolated and regimented.
Who would we be indebted to when it comes to the turnaround in the way Shia history is, or Shia theology is discussed? Because if I'm looking at the beginning, maybe I see McDermott and the theology of Sheikh al-Mufid. Massignon and others like them, loathe them. They do take us a bit deeper into the studies. But if there is one figure who you'd say, this is the one who stands up and says, hey, there's a school over here. They have their own literature. They are part of the formative period I'm asking you directly.
I mean, it's really obvious. It's Henri Corbin. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think Madeleine actually is very important. And I do remember one conference about 10, 12 years ago where, some people in the audience thought he was having a moment because his summing up comments were not about the conference. His summing up comments began with, "What if the Quran is true?" And so everyone was thinking and saying, "This is a bit of a shift. This is not what we normally do," because the conference was not on the Quran. But what that does show you is that for him, the question of history and truth is important. And that's certainly reflected in what he does. So, what he wrote, for example, the succession, he believes that to be true. He believes that to be an accurate representation of what happened and what should have and what should not have happened.
And he got blasted for it.
Of course. But I mean,
why?
I think the issue came down to the classic one of source criticism. The people say, well, you're too gullible with the sources. And in fact, recently on Facebook, we were having this discussion about there was one particularly nasty review, or rather flippant review, in I believe it was in a Hungarian Orientalist journal, where it literally just said, "Surely you must be joking, Professor Madeleine."
Wow.
And nothing else.
So can I just put this in context for the viewers?
Yes.
The Succession to Muhammad is the book that we're talking about.
Yes.
It's obviously one of the most controversial periods in Islamic history. It's more simplified possibly by Leslie Hazelton, very simplistic if anyone wants to understand a bit of what's going on. But Madeleine takes this on. He's highly respected up to this point. He hasn't really... He's produced some works on Shi'ism, but all of a sudden he comes out with what is a book discussing an area that for that period, Shi'ism, one may argue, is being understood through a Sunni lens.
Well, there's two things going on here. One is the way he's reading the early historical sources and taking them pretty much at face value as something that you can use. And the second thing, which is perhaps radical, is that he's using the Quran as a historical source as well. And, in Quranic studies, that is not normal, right? In Quranic studies, it's all about where does the Quran come from? At what point did this text become relatively fixed? What sort of variations were they? How was it transmitted? I mean, sort of standard issues around where does this text come from?
Did it even exist?
Not is it true, right?
Yeah.
So his point is, well, this is what the Quran says. So his reading is that if you read the Quran carefully and you consider and you realize that this is a historical source which is contemporaneous to the Prophet, then this should have happened.
Sure.
Right? Of course, what's also quite important to remember is that book is not what you might call a mainstream Shīʿī reading of history either.
Yes.
Right? So if anything, it approximates to a Zaydi position.
Sure.
But certainly his point on the succession of the daughter of the Prophet, on Fâṭima Zahra alayhi salam, that is something which is not kind of normatively Shīʿī in any way. Exactly.
No way.
But that shows you that is really his position because he's adamant on that. And he said it many, many times that, if there was a succession, it should have been the daughter, and everything arises from the authority of the daughter.
But the hostility.
Yes. So, as I said, it's because, first of all, you're taking the Quran seriously as a historical source, which is contemporaneous and which is, which gives meaning, which gives normative effect to the reading of history. And secondly, because he's reading these different historical sources in conjunction with that as sources which can tell you something. And we know that we have the classic kind of 200-year gap problem, right?
Yes.
That most of these sources are not contemporaneous to the Prophet, but they come from much later. So I think it's really methodologically it was the issue, and as I said, secondarily it's the actual position that he puts forward, which, as I said, has become more kind of clear in what he's really articulating with respect to Fâṭima Zahra. But so that was, I think, for many people shocking. And I remember being at a seminar in Oxford when it was just about to come out in the Oriental Institute, and he basically gave the talk about the book, and most of the people there really had no idea what was going on, and they were like, this is not anything, this is not what we've heard. Some people were saying, is this because you become Shīʿī? And he was like, no, it's not Shīʿī. This is how I read the sources.
Sure.
And I think that's important. It's, for him, these sources do tell us something about what happened. And there is an issue around method, which is as critical there.
Father, you were going to say, yeah.
It's just slightly frustrating, for one thing, that Madlung, for example, made a particular historical judgment based on his readings of the sources, which is a perfectly legitimate thing for a scholar. All of the Sunni sort of scholars, Western scholars who criticized him, they themselves did exactly the same thing. For example, the whole question of that gap between the death of the Prophet and the final compilation of the Quran, they all, for years, until people like Crone and Patricia Crone and Cook arrived, they all accepted the Islamic narrative and the sources of that narrative without any real problem.
Sure.
We in the West use sources much older than Abu Mikhnaf and others without any real difficulty. I mean, we in the church, we read Bede the Venerable's History of England as a perfectly legitimate historical source. It's much, much older, and yet we don't have any problem. So I think the issue of source criticism in Islamic studies by Western scholars has become a bit of a sort of Damocles. I mean, you're going to get attacked either way. If you use the sources critically, your Islamic readership is going to attack you. If you read them uncritically, your Western readership is going to attack you. You really have and this point was made by Harold Motzki. I mean, he wrote a great deal about the question of the sources, that you actually are in a double bind. But Western scholars who attack people like Madlung, they did exactly the same thing. I know that in the West, for example, among Western scholars, there's a big question about hadith. So let's put aside hadith for a moment, because we have a number of very early historical chronicles from that early period, most of them based on Abu Mikhnaf, admittedly. But we've got no reason to simply dismiss Abu Mikhnaf as completely unreliable. He's got eyewitness accounts, which is what history is. And I think we are overcritical of the Islamic sources and less critical of the Western Christian and non-Christian sources. There's a bit of a double bind there for me.
You mentioned Henri Corbin. His effect, his influence.
So, I mean, Henri Corbin's kind of magnum opus on Islam Irania is, it probably even shouldn't be called Irania, it should be called On Islam Shiite or something like that, because that's basically his position, that if you really want to understand the intellectual, the spiritual, the mystical tradition of Islam, it's Shiism. So, even when he's talking about figures who are not normally considered to be Shīʿī, he's kind of putting them in that same milieu. So, the way he reads Ibn Arabi, the way he reads Sohrawardi, the way he reads some of the successors of Sohrawardi, is very much as if they are, at the very least, culturally Shīʿī.
Sure.
If not kind of theologically Shīʿī. So that work really changed things, and it's interesting when it came out. I mean, it came out as a result of having been in Iran and taught for many years at Tehran and set up the French Institute in Tehran and at least the research part of it and the publications, and many critical editions of texts in Arabic and Persian. It came out in the early 70s. And it came out after he'd already published a history of Islamic philosophy, which again was very, very much kind of skewed towards, Shiism as the fundamental philosophical tradition in Islam.
Yes.
So this is far, before most people were interested in Iran. This is before 1979. This is before people asking the question of, so what is someone who is Shia?
Yeah.
And certainly in the public discourse, this was not terribly well known. But at the same time, it's coming out of that time in the late 60s, early 70s, in which, whether it's in France or whether it's in Britain, elsewhere, there is this kind of cultural opening. There's this kind of all sorts of experimentation with lifestyles and so forth going on. And suddenly people were traveling and discovering both Sunni and Shia Islam, but often discovering them through a mystical path.
Sure.
So you have, one of the best ones to look at, account for this is Robert Irwin's Memoirs of a Dervish, which is a wonderful account of being a student in Oxford in the late 60s, early 70s, ending up at some point becoming a Shadhili Sufi, right? And then experimenting with all sorts of things. That was a story of many people. That's like, my own supervisor, John Cooper.
Yes.
Allah yarhamah. He became Shii in Iran, having taken that same path. He was in Oxford in the late 60s, early 70s. He ends up in Iran. He ends up joining the Hausa and becoming a seminary student.
Sure.
So the time that Korban's work came out, it was a time in which it would be receptive. And there were people who were interested genuinely in religion and genuinely in philosophy, for whom Korban was a massive revelation. It's only later that I think people who are Shia suddenly, this is really cool that we've got something like Korban. But Korban's impact was immense. And it was there already from the early 70s. And, if he'd have survived after the revolution, he would have probably said certain other things, perhaps. Certainly some of his students did. But he really put Shia Islam on the map. And not only did he put it on the map, he put it at the center of the study of Islam. And that's what was really radical. That, if you really want to understand what is really of value, spiritually, intellectually, mystically, every aspect which is beyond just the basic law, then you need to understand Shia Islam.
You said some of his students then begin to emerge.
Yeah,
so who are we talking about?
I mean, we've got people like Christian Jombe. You've got like collaborators or people who are close to him, like Sayyid Hussain Nas. You've got Dariush Shairan. So Dariush Shairan is extremely significant figure, passed away a few years ago, but he wrote two very important books in French on Henri Corbin. And Shairan himself was a fellow traveler. He is someone who's very interested in Shia mysticism. He also happened to be the leading Indologist of his generation. So, he wrote this 2-volume work on Indian philosophies in Persian, which is still, the best work probably in Persian available. And it was that kind of milieu, everyone talks about that circle of Corbin and Allama Tabatabai and Dariush Shairan and Sayyid Hussain Nasr and, Mursa Mutari, all these people meeting quite regularly in Tehran to discuss, of course, Shia philosophy and theology and mysticism, but also they'd be discussing Indian thought, they'd be discussing Chinese thought and so forth. And what was interesting is that was a very productive time, because it also showed that there were people in the Shia seminary who were genuinely interested in these things.
Sure.
They were interested in things which are more than just, rules of how to do wudu and, how to pray and, this and that. They were genuinely interested in other traditions.
So were there people from the seminary who were going to study in the West?
So that had already started as well. That had started. But that circle was very kind of iconic in that period. So yes, you had people who had gone. You had people like Sayyid Kazim Assad who were familiar with Western thought. You then, of course, had the late Mehdi Hairi, arguably one of the great neglected philosophers of the 20th century.
Did he end up dying in Canada? Toronto?
He ended up in the States.
In the States, okay. He was in Toronto for a period.
He was in Toronto. Yeah. He did his PhD in Toronto. He lived in the States for many years. And I believe his children live in the States. But I mean, there were people who went and they were genuinely interested. And even now, because of those sorts of early influences, this is why it's not unusual if you're sitting in somewhere like Qom and you're speaking to a fairly well-read seminary student, they will ask you a question about, Zhuangzi, what do you think's going on there, and how can we kind of relate with those teachings of in ethics, because of those sorts of things, and I think you can make a whole other argument about how this familiarity, between Shi'i thought and other things was there in the circle, because you see that in the work of Qurban himself. So if you read On Islam Iranien, you really need to understand something of Qurban's own journey. You need to understand something about his early embrace of Heidegger and his embrace of German phenomenology. You need to understand that he was very much interested in Orthodox Christian theology and philosophy, mainly through the Russian emigres, exiles who were in Paris, and they produced a lot of work. I mean, at least some of the figures I'm interested in, who I in the Orthodox tradition, are those who come out of Paris. And then, people who now, like colleagues of mine at Exeter and other places, who then read people like Bulgakov, right, and Berdayev and people like that. These were the people that Qurban was also reading. And that's why he's making these connections. So he's saying, okay, the Shia have this concept of walaya.
Yeah.
So how can I make sense of it? Well, there's a medieval German tradition of the Gottesfreunden. There is this idea of divine humanity in Orthodoxy, etc., etc. And
Sure.
and those kind of links for someone like Qurban were meaningful, because Qurban, I think, was a pluralist. He wasn't a traditionalist. I mean, that's a different argument, right? He wasn't, a perennialist traditionalist in the way someone like Sayyid Hussein Nasr and others are. But he did think that there was value and truth to be found in lots of different places, and that those different things, there was value in finding the linkages between them and using one to make sense of the other. I think that was very much important for him. So if one is now, someone who's Shi'i, who's influenced by Qurban, it's very difficult to step away from that.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to say, yes, okay, that's fine. I'm only going to look at Shi'i stuff. I'm not going to look at Orthodoxy. I'm not going to look at Buddhism. I'm not going to look at this and that because it doesn't speak to me. If anything, if you're going to be faithful to that vision, then you need to do that.
There's no doubt the 79 revolution then has a huge effect on how Shi'ism is being discussed, especially now on a question of political theory as well. So we saw with Qurban, you're opening the doors of philosophy and mysticism maybe, and you saw previous to that maybe on theology. But then with the Iranian revolution, you've got the surge of works about even the hidden imam. Suddenly it's not only about, the wilaya of the jurist. Now it's also about who's the man they're talking about, with a lot of eschatological type literature involved. Did you notice that this surge of literature within the academic world post-79?
I did notice, especially coming out of Iran, a particular emphasis on eschatology.
Sure.
And an apocalyptic eschatology. And there have been a number of works that have been written. But I remember one of the ex-presidents of Iran making an address before the United Nations, talking about the Mahdi coming to restore justice. And everybody sat in stunned silence, because I think most of them didn't know what he was talking about. But it was a profoundly linking, of course, this kind of eschatological or apocalyptic period with the formation of the State of Israel, of course, and all that other political stuff. But it's curious, because it's not only in Iranian Shi'ism, in fundamentalist Christianity, within the last 2 decades, there has been a sudden outpouring of literature about the last times and the rapture and all the other things that go together with specifically apocalyptic understanding of eschatology. So I have seen that coming out of Iran, and I'm inclined to step back a little, because I do recognize traits of the same thing in a sort of Christianity, fundamentalist in the worst sense of the word, that I wouldn't accept, a theology that I wouldn't accept. So I'm inclined to step back a little bit. But I am more and more interested in the person of the Mahdi. And I understand, coming out from 1979, if you're going to institute a particular political vision that puts power into the hands of the jurists in such a way that they have to be in contact with the Mahdi to make sure that Shia Islam is continuing and being protected, then of course the person of the Mahdi is going to become more and more interesting. And I think that from the beginning, I've tried to introduce to Western readership, non-Muslim readership, some of these extraordinary personalities. I think that the person of Ali himself still needs to be introduced to a Western readership because he's a difficult figure for Western readers, Ali. If you give Najah Balagha to a Westerner and say, read that, they wouldn't come away raving about it. They would struggle with some of the concepts. I think that the person of the hidden imam or the imam in occultation is completely unknown in the West, and would be very and especially since he has a Christian mother, it would be a very interesting thing to either take her, Nargis, or take him and begin to open him up to a Western readership. The concept, it's not an unknown concept, the idea of the hidden savior.
You all believe in a savior who's a bit hidden at the moment,
and yet it's completely foreign. The theology of Mahdi, of especially of Ithna Ashari Shia, of the Mahdi, and the idea of him coming back to restore justice, being accompanied by Isa, but that he is the one, not Isa, really. This is foreign to Western readership. Sure. It would be great to open it up. Now,
I want to just go back a bit here. Someone once said, academia is where there's the most envy for the least at stake. I want to first begin with one type of envy. Shia envy. Have you witnessed that Shia academics, there aren't many, but even amongst them, have you witnessed that there is envy going on behind the scenes?
I mean, this is a difficult question because most of those people are friends. And of course, we disagree on all sorts of things. I'm not so sure about that. It's certainly not in the field.
Not in the field.
I mean,
okay.
Me. I've tried to be as encouraging as I can
Correct.
to lots of people, and even those who I don't disagree with, who I don't agree with, and I think that's important to do that. But there is this kind of image that you have to play a certain kind of game if you want to get ahead, right? So if you want to get ahead in Islamic studies, the best way to do that is, for example, to downplay any Shia identity that you have and really kind of just go along with a relatively normative Sunni narrative and approach to the study of Islam. And that's how you get the job, and that's how you get tenure and so forth. And I suspect there are people who believe that. I don't think that's the case anymore.
Yes.
And that may have been part of the Sajidina issue then as well. There's a certain way in which Islamic studies works, and there's certain things that you can say and certain things you can't say. That's just completely gone now. Yeah. And so I think things are changing. And you are getting, very serious people emerging who are major names. I mean, you've got someone like Muhammad Ali Amir Mozi, who's been around for a very long time, and he's certainly not afraid of speaking his mind.
Divine Guide in Early Shi'ism, well worth reading.
Yes, and
finishing the brilliant.
And not just that, but you've got other people emerging. You've got people like Najm Haider at Columbia, Barnard College. You've got Nabil Hussain. You've got Hassan Ali. You've got a number of figures who have come through academia. You've got Ihab,
yeah.
Although he's very careful not to identify as himself as a Shia studies person. I understand why he's doing that as well. So there are a number of people who are emerging, and then when I look at how many grad students are coming through, I mean, not so much in this country, because academia generally is weaker in many ways. There are far fewer jobs, there are far fewer opportunities. But if you look at North America, there are so many students who are coming through. And they're coming through on every aspect you can imagine, everything from law to devotion to studying sermons, from the pulpit, everything.
Yes.
Culture, the culture of the music, of the Latmiya or the Noha and stuff. I mean, there's so much going on. And those individuals will end up in jobs.
I've got $5 million to spare.
Yeah.
Sitting with me. I want to establish either a fellowship for 10 years, guaranteed, a chair, or the down payment in payments, 3 or 4 payments of an institute. And the second question is, the first one is, which one should we go for? The second question is, should we call it the Imam Ali of Shia studies or the Imam Ali of Islamic studies? I'm going to let you both answer.
So there were lots of questions there.
Yeah. While I've got you guys here, I'm going to get everything from you.
I mean, obviously, my first thing is like, why only 5 million? 5 million is not enough.
Okay. But hence I broke fellowship 10 years, chair full. I just want to make this clear to viewers.
Your prices are correct.
My prices are correct. Yeah.
But this is precisely why I'm saying it's not enough.
Not enough. Okay.
Look, what you want to do is you want to establish something which is going to have a lasting impact. One of the biggest problems with philanthropic giving in academia, especially in kind of what you might call niche or sort of sectional areas, is that they don't have sustainability. So even if you establish one chair, as one individual, right? Now, yes, okay, they might have students and so forth, and they might have PhD students, but that person could suddenly turn around and say, well, actually, I'm not going to supervise in this area. And there's nothing you can do about it because that person is so senior, he can do whatever he wants.
Sure.
So the issue is you want to look at the lasting impact. What are you going to get the most, out of that money? How are you going to get that? The second issue is on the Shia versus Islamic.
Yes.
So I would say, why be so narrow? Why not say it's for the humanities, the study of the humanities?
Interesting.
Right? I mean, in many ways, I think Islamic studies is going to have to change. I mean, I've been doing this and increasingly getting criticized for, but as far as I'm concerned, Islamic studies needs to be radically decolonized. And only one aspect of that, the current colonization, is that it's Sunni normative.
Yeah.
You would have to be blind not to see that Islamic studies is Sunni normative. But why are we being so narrow, right? So, for example, Father Christopher mentioned the Nahj al-Balagha. You just take one aspect of the Nahj, the sayings of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Why don't we put that up with works like the Analects of Confucius or other works?
Yeah.
There are so many works out there on ethics and living the good life and philosophy as a way of life and so forth out there. Why is it not considered part of world literature? Why is it not considered to be part of a global heritage in understanding what it means to be human?
Yeah, because you mentioned earlier Heidegger, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky. All of these, their works are read by everybody. Nahj al-Balagha doesn't even come to the fore.
But that's our own fault for not presenting it properly and translating it poorly and et cetera, et cetera. But that's just one example of what you could do. So, I think what we need to do is we need to say, yes, this is part of the study of religion, but it's part of the study of culture. It's what humanity is. And so, yes, if you want to have that direct impact in that particular area, you endow it within Islamic studies.
So Exeter University, what would the title be of what you've just said?
I think it should be a chair in the study of humanities.
Chair in the study of humanities.
Yes,
Father Clohessy.
Can I be more
At the Pontifical Institute in Rome, 5 million is available.
Can I be more provocative? That the Pontifical Institute in Rome is an academic institution run by the Roman Catholic Church in which we offer a full academic course in Islam, in classical Arabic and Islam, so that students can study Islam at its very source in the original language. There exists not a single institute in the Islamic world that does the same for Christianity.
Near the Vatican, even.
It doesn't have to be near the Vatican. But a college in which Christianity generally is studied at its sources, that is in Hebrew and in Greek, and in the writings of the Church Fathers. I don't think such an institute exists, which means that in dialogue, you very rarely have equal partners. We come into dialogue, and I mean, this sounds arrogant, but we come in with a substantial knowledge of Islam, of Arabic, and of the text.
Sure.
And almost always we face people who know nothing about Christianity.
Sure.
So dialogue doesn't happen.
Sure.
Just us answering questions about the Trinity. go and buy a book and read about the Trinity. I think it would be wonderful to see in the Islamic world somewhere a college in which students can make a profoundly deep academic study of Christianity in its own texts and in its own languages, which is Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew.
That's a brilliant point.
No, that's absolutely right. And you know, it's actually very rare to even find an academic context in that. So, like, you know, forget the seminary. The only place which comes close, but they've got a long way to go, is Danishgah Adyan, which is in Qom, which has a serious concern with the study of religions. But again, my problem with that, and also with some departments, say in Southeast Asia, etc., is that they only concern themselves with, you know, the so-called Abrahamic. And I said this once ages ago to a colleague in Jakarta. I was like, why aren't you studying Buddhism? You know, Buddhism is far more important in this context. Buddhism and Hinduism are far more important in this context than Judaism. I mean, like, when's the last time you came across a Jew in the Southeast Asian context? So I think there is that kind of willingness that has to be expressed. And, you know, one way you could do that is to take intercultural studies a bit more seriously. So one place which has tried, another place which has tried to do this is University of Gajah Mada in Yogyakarta. But again, it's pretty limited. It's pretty limited. So, you know, and it's externally funded. The money comes from the US. It doesn't come from local sources. So I think there's a number. The funding issue is actually a big question behind this as well. So, you know, as Father Christopher says, you know, it's a businessman, a millionaire, billionaire saying, yes, I'm going to give you 5 million for an Imam Ali chair, you know, and I want this person to, I don't know, produce this book on Imam Ali, etc. Fine, but why not produce a book which then brings those teachings into some sort of dialogue or conversation, or it actually takes those other traditions seriously, you know? So the book I've been talking about, I spoke to say Nizamuddin, our friend.
Yes.
So my next book is on Walaya, but it's going to try and engage seriously with the concept of divine humanity as it exists in the Orthodox tradition. Because I find that it's not the same thing, right? Because at the end of the day, you know, it's not a Trinitarian concept, and it's, you know, the whole intersection of God and man is a bit more complicated, but it is a creative tension. It's a creative dynamic which can actually produce something quite interesting, and which can produce something which goes a bit beyond Qur'ān, because Qur'ān kind of says a few things, but he doesn't take them through to what these actually mean. You know, he sort of he basically says, well, and it's a sheikhis, and so what the sheikhis say about the imam is what it is. But there's much more which could be said. And that's where then this broader conversation about eschatology can open. That's where the broader question about soteriology and redemption and you know, a final healing or resolution of the cosmos. That's where that argument and that conversation can happen. So yeah, I mean, the question you ask is complicated. You know, so what's going to have the lasting impact? I would say the thing which will have the lasting impact is not one chair, but a number of positions alongside funded grad students. That's going to have more of an impact.
But I think, you know, Imam Ali, chair of Shia Studies at Hartford, the Global Shi'ism Project at Harvard, the Sayyidah Khadija Fellowship at Cambridge. There's a few others which are now emerging. Slowly we're hearing about accreditations. I think there's a Sheikh al-Mufid seminary in the States as well. So, and yourself at the Pontifical, you've got accredited Shia Studies program? Or is it more under Islamic studies, but you teach us? Because I was so fortunate that I was invited to speak there, and I saw your library, and, you know, seeing the names of Khou'i and Khomeini and Tabatabai and Kulaini and Hilli and Saduq and Mufid in this environment was phenomenal.
No, look, I teach I don't have the chair of Shi'ism. We don't have such a chair. We teach Islamic studies, and I look after Shia history, Shia theology, Shia texts. And occasionally we do get visiting professors in who take other aspects of Shi'ism. It's not just myself. But I'm the resident there, and I kind of control the students who are going to do Shia texts for their master's degrees. I look after those students. So, but there are centers opening up all over the place where people can now study Shi'ism. You don't have to come to Rome, to do it our way. Our way is an old way. We were the kind of pioneers in the Western world, our Pontifical Institute. Now there's so many universities and colleges opening up in various places.
Yes.
But I certainly think I've seen an increase in the number of students tackling Shia texts specifically for their master's degrees. And I think I was the first to produce a Shia work. But now there are a number of students every year who take Shia texts, sometimes classical texts, sometimes more contemporary texts.
Last couple of questions before we end. And it's been a riveting discussion. Said Sajjad, I want to ask you in particular. When you're in the academic world, sometimes you could be around people who are very dismissive, arrogant towards believers, very cold towards tradition, questioning, as we discussed earlier about the sources. In the Shi'i world, when you're an academic, you then possibly that night have to go and listen to a khatib, a mambari, a zakir, who may not necessarily have been so well grounded in the academic studies, has just had not even a traditional Hawzawi training to the highest level, very basic. How do you maintain humility in a gathering where the person sitting up there, you literally have studied that area much more than they have? You could see they're all over the place in their understanding of it. Does it ever bring about a certain sense of what am I doing here? Or is there another way in which you approach such gatherings?
So I know a lot of friends who just don't go.
Sure.
Right? And that's not just academics. People may have read one book, for example. And
all 21 pages of it.
Yeah. I mean, really, to be honest, what is sad is to see the major deficit I see is a rhetorical deficit. So most of the people who are on the member are just bad speakers.
Sure.
Right? They don't understand how oratory works. They have very little literary taste. Right? So, I remember as a kid listening to majalis from the member, and you'd have someone who could recite poetry and would actually often compose their own poetry, because poetry is meaningful. I mean, maybe for this generation, my kids, they're not as interested. It's a less of a not the same kind of attention span and approach to the.
Or maybe the language not as expressive.
The language as well, but what that showed is that the people who were speaking or giving sermons understood the culture, right? It wasn't just that they had a training in theology. In many cases, their training in theology was as poor as the ones today. But they knew how language worked, and they knew how to persuade people, and they could speak to them as equals in their use of language and their understanding of the world around them. That's what's really, I think, quite disappointing with what's happening now.
Sure.
So in terms of the humility, as I said, I will sit there because for me, going to majlis is very simple. It's about mourning, right? So I will kind of switch off for the first half an hour or 45 minutes because that's the price you have to pay for being there. But then when you do speak to someone afterwards, you say, make a bit more of an effort.
Sure.
Make a bit more of an effort because, there is this gradual dumbing down. We see this everywhere, to be honest. Like it happens in universities as well. There's gradual dumbing down of what we would expect our students to do. We very rarely, I mean, it's probably different in Rome, but we very rarely expect our undergrads to be able to deal with difficult Arabic texts, even fourth-year students. Giving them a serious theological text in Arabic, most of my colleagues wouldn't dream of doing it, just because the students wouldn't be able to manage.
And that's where you maybe need the Hawza academia balance.
But I remember as a first-year student, I wasn't reading Arabic, but I knew people in Arabic were still reading like sections from Baydawi, from Baydawi's tafsir, and or reading like pre-Islamic poetry in their second year. I mean, that would be you would be considered crazy to try to do that now.
Sure.
Right. So that there is this general kind of dumbing down which has happened in academia, a simplification, a change perhaps in what is the purpose of doing what we're doing, and maybe that's happening in the Minbar as well. And so when they have these meetings before Muharram where they talk about what to do in the Minbar, and I think they're always talking about the wrong thing. They're kind of, those meetings are like what to avoid this year.
Yeah, I've never been invited to one of those, but yeah, they sound interesting. Yeah.
Because it bolsters someone's authority. Right?
Yes.
That's not what they should be talking about is, guys, make an effort.
Yeah.
Make an effort. Do your homework. Read some literature. Know what's going on in the world and be able to communicate well. Work on your rhetorical skills. You can actually be taught these things.
Sure.
It's really not.
Sure.
It's not just a question of, yes, your job is there to just, I don't know, convey this particular point about what the importance of prayer is over 10 days or whatever, right? It's more like, okay, but how do you do that? What sort of examples are you bringing to and really, for me, I'm kind of obsessed with this issue of lack of literary or of adab literacy, so to speak.
Sure.
Because it happens in every language. It happens in every language. And so, even for those who are speaking in English, be aware of what English literature is.
Sure.
Be aware of what the literary background is to what we discuss today. We may live in an Instagram, TikTok world, but a lot of those memes ultimately come out of sources which have been around for centuries. Ideas, tropes, the proverbs, these sayings that we have, these are centuries old. They're part of the literary fabric of what English is. And if you really want to convey any sort of idea, you have to do it in that way.
Final question.
Can I,
go ahead, please,
I
Father.
Ask the same question because for me, it's the other way around for me in the sense that
interesting.
Almost always, except when I'm in my office in Rome, I'm talking to people who know far more about Shia Islam than I do. Of course.
True. Yes.
I mean, I'm an outsider who doesn't practice Shia Islam, and I have a sort of a book knowledge on some aspects of Shia Islam. And therefore, I have to keep reminding myself, you're talking to people who know this and live this and who read far more deeply than you do because so that's quite an important thing. But the thing that I've noticed, and I've noticed it in Rome, but in other places, is this growing gap between those who are trained in the classical sources of Christianity or of Islam and these popular preachers who are able to hold an audience with almost nothing. And I think, for example, of Ratzinger. So whatever people think about Ratzinger, he was a profoundly deep theologian. I mean, maybe the greatest theologian of our century for us.
Really?
There's no doubt about it. Ratzinger was brilliant. He wasn't a great speaker.
Yes.
And so he couldn't hold a crowd, but his depth of knowledge of the sources was stupendous. But he would easily be dismissed by popular preachers who are far more charismatic, have far less understanding of the sources, but who are able to hold people by paperback theology, just, a clever thought. And I've noticed that happening in
I always think of the Musa Harun paradigm with Pharaoh.
Yeah.
That, you know what, we need a balance.
Yeah.
I'm eloquent. My brother may come in with a different form of eloquence here. But we both need to strengthen each other. Yeah. And I think we need that also. We need those who can speak, and we need those who are even deeper versed in the literature, who can actually work in tandem with one another.
As long as they work in tandem.
As long as they work in tandem.
Because in issues like akhlaq, in ethics, you have popular preachers who are pulling people away from a far more reasoned approach to an aspect of medical or sexual ethics.
Of course.
And so you have the doctor or even the expert in fiqh who for years has studied these issues. Now you get a popular preacher trying to persuade people that it's all wicked or it's all wrong, pulling people, and that's a great worry. In all the faiths, not just in Islam.
And you see this on things like Twitter and Instagram.
Yes, of course.
Where it doesn't matter which religion it is. You've
Yeah.
got the same sort of issue, the most harsh kind of responses. The very idea that you can have a different opinion is considered almost bizarre.
Sure.
And yes, you're right. It happens on the big issues. It happens on the issues of sexuality. It happens on things like evolution. It happens on sort of different areas of bioethics. You know, I mean, abortion. I can think of lots of American Catholic friends for whom abortion has been such a divisive issue in recent times because of the changing positions in the Supreme Court, and that's happening also amongst Muslims as well in the same case. So, I think in many ways sometimes you feel like saying just stay away from places like Twitter, because it's better for your sanity, because but then you've got this other issue of the pulpit. I mean, the pulpit is important.
Sure.
And, we come from traditions where pulpit is very important.
Yeah.
So the responsibility of the pulpit is precisely one where, it's not just, the world, you have a literary taste, you understand your theology, but you also need to be, encouraging the right sort of values. Just saying, okay, you can disagree on this position. Doesn't change the fact that you're still Shia, you're still Catholic. You can disagree on abortion. You can disagree on this and that, and you can also know that there does actually have to be a definitive, authoritative position on this as well, right? And sometimes those positions can vary slightly, but it's perfectly right for a religious tradition to say this is what we consider to be authoritative in this as well.
Sure.
That becomes even more of an issue in issues around sexuality and so forth as well. So, I said this in a conversation with someone in Lebanon a few years ago. It's like, where are our public theologians? Right?
Yes.
In the Shia tradition, for me, this is a big issue.
Even jurists, Sajjad. Jurists who are very well versed in the literature.
But who are capable of thinking broadly. I mean, like...
Thinking broadly. And also, how many lectures have you heard from them? Even on their field, it's like behind closed doors, Bahth al-Kharij classes, said Kamal al-Haidari being one of them who came out and said, listen, I'm going to talk public. Now, irrespective of opinion, it would be great if you're anti-academic.
Yes.
Academic hasn't done Hausa. They're just popular. Okay, you come out and do the preaching.
I mean, I said this to them. Like I said, do we have someone like Rowan Williams?
Yes.
Who will engage, for example, with the atheist, who will engage with people interested in philosophy, who will engage with people who are interested in literature, right? Who engages with Muslims and Jews and many different other types of Christians, etc. And who actually thinks it's his duty to inform a public debate.
Sure.
Right. And I think that's the issue. It's like, what sort of responsibility does an individual have to inform public debate? And for that, they should be reaching out to academics.
Yeah.
Of course, I think they should. In the same way that I think academics should take people in the Hausa seriously, because there's some very good scholars in the Hausa as well. I think, recently I was in Najaf and it's striking, it's absolutely striking that this division, Najaf is more extreme, as you know, than Qom on this. The division between the Hausawi and the academic is just like there's no meeting.
Sure.
And sometimes they talk about it, it would be a nice idea, but there's no actual attempt at bringing them into conversation with each other. And that I think is very sad, because the resources that we now have in Iraq should mean that this is happening all the time. We no longer are in a position where Iran defines Shia Islam for the world.
Sure.
I mean, we don't have to be in that position anymore.
Correct.
Whether that's for establishing chairs in universities, or whether that's like, about a public debate about what Shia, Iraq needs to step up.
Iran in itself is redefining itself, even with the Saudi deal. It could even be redefining where it's going. So it's not even one way.
But in Iran,
Iraq should step up.
Yeah, because in Iran, what I expect in theological terms is no change.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
But Iraq, I think it's about money. It's about openness as well. Now, we know there are a few people who are genuinely open.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they're the minority.
Sure.
that's still the problem.
My final question, you've both written a number of books. The favorite of yours from the ones that you've published, what would be the favorite that you could plug to the audience on this podcast? If there was one that you were proud of and you said, put that as my legacy from a book from the books that you've written. Father?
For me, it's the most recent book, the Predictive Dreams of Karbalāঃ, because I think that dreams play a fantastically important role in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. We know this, and are to be taken seriously. They're not to be dismissed as fairy tales or fantasies. And I think that tracking the predictions of the martyrdom of Hussein and the aftermath of that martyrdom through people's dream experiences or their spiritual experiences or these profound encounters they had with the divine, whatever the nature of those encounters, because it's not really for us to define that sort of encounter. For me, that book was stuff that I'd collected and then looked at again far more deeply, and I loved every moment of writing it.
Very interesting. Cesar Jan?
So the funny thing, of course, is that I'm not a Shīʿī Studies specialist. I never defined myself as that.
But you and Ihab are coming out with the Oxford
Handbook, yeah.
Yeah.
But we did that for academic political reasons.
Okay.
Sometimes you've got to take control of an area before someone else does.
Yeah. And I know Ihab's very passionate about that. Yeah.
So I would actually mention something which I worked on a number of years ago with a good friend of mine, Firas Hamza. And it was the first volume of an anthology project, the Anthology of Quranic Commentaries. And that still remains the one work which I've been involved in, which is widely used. And we had a polemical intention, which was that this was not going to be the study of Quran as normatively Sunni.
Sure.
So we had all sorts of commentaries, Sunni, Ibadi, Zaydi, Ismaili, Nashri, etc., and across different languages as well. So I think that's the work which also to buy is probably the cheapest. As well.
Yeah. Was it only $231?
No, I think it's actually, I think the paperback's about 25 quid.
No.
Yeah. And it's the one which is used in classes around
Are you still going for $90 up? Because I know some of your philosophy ones.
The philosophy ones will be, yes.
Yeah.
I might too. I haven't looked recently.
I would love to offer you guys a discount, but you're going to have to contact them personally for that. Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And hopefully welcome you on again sometime in the future. Thank you all for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.